Where 3 minutes in a barbershop taught a gang more than 3 years on the streets. They say you should never judge a book by its cover. In Wilson's barbershop on the corner of Malcolm X Boulevard, 3 gang members were about to learn this lesson the hard way. They saw a fat man in a barber's chair. What they missed was the heavyweight champion who had knocked out 35 professionals in the ring. Some lessons come with a haircut. Some come with a hospital bill. It was a typical Saturday afternoon at Wilson's barbershop, where the air buzzed with the sound of clippers and animated conversations. Marcus Washington, a heavy-set black man in his mid-40s, sat quietly in his usual corner chair, engrossed in a magazine that seemed almost comically small in his massive hands. At 280 pounds, Marcus filled the barber's chair completely, but there was a gentle dignity in how he carried himself, a calm that seemed to radiate from his very presence. A few chairs down, a young man they called Young Buck whispered and snickered to his barber, making not-so-subtle comments about Marcus's size, completely unaware of who he was really dealing with. The atmosphere in the shop shifted dramatically when a black SUV pulled up outside. Through the large front window, everyone could see 3 members of the notorious 18th Street Cobras step out. The local gang had been making moves to establish their territory in the neighborhood, and their reputation preceded them. Snake, their leader, strutted in first, followed by his 2 lieutenants, Diesel and Razor. The usual chatter in the shop died down to a tense silence, broken only by the persistent hum of electric clippers. Snake moved through the barbershop like he owned it, his sneakers squeaking against the checkered linoleum floor. The overhead fluorescent lights caught the gold chain around his neck and the fresh tear tattoo under his left eye, a recent addition meant to enhance his intimidating appearance. Behind him, Diesel and Razor spread out slightly, a practiced formation they'd used to corner many victims before. The usual barbershop symphony of buzzing clippers, friendly banter, and sports debates died down to nothing more than nervous whispers and the soft hum of electric tools. Marcus sat in his chair like an immovable mountain, his broad shoulders and thick neck filling the black vinyl seat. The magazine in his hands, an old issue of Sports Illustrated featuring Mike Tyson, seemed almost fragile in his massive fingers. The corner chair had been his Saturday spot for so long that the cushion had a slight permanent impression from his weight. The afternoon sun streaming through the front window cast his shadow large against the shop's faded beige wall, a silent testament to his imposing presence. Snake planted himself directly in front of Marcus, his shadow falling across the magazine's glossy pages. The gang leader was tall and lean, with a switchblade's sharpness to his movements, but standing before Marcus, he looked almost boyish in comparison. The artificial swagger in his stance betrayed his nervousness. Something in Marcus's calm demeanor had thrown him off balance, though he'd never admit it. "Aye, big man, you're in my chair," Snake announced, his voice carrying that particular pitch of manufactured authority. The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy with threat and expectation. The other patrons in the shop shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pretending to be absorbed in their phones, while others watched the confrontation unfold with wary eyes. Marcus didn't immediately respond. Instead, he took his time finishing the paragraph he was reading, his eyes moving deliberately across the page. This small act of dismissal caused Snake's jaw to clench, his right hand unconsciously curling into a fist. Finally, Marcus spoke, his deep voice carrying the weight of years and absolute certainty. "Been coming here 15 years, always sit in this chair." Each word was measured, calm, but underlaid with steel. The simplicity of the response seemed to anger Snake more than any challenge could have. He leaned in closer, his leather jacket creaking with the movement, his breath smelling of menthol cigarettes and trying too hard to intimidate. "Maybe you ain't heard. This is Cobra territory now, and that's my chair." Behind him, Diesel and Razor exchanged glances, their hands drifting toward their pockets, a movement that didn't go unnoticed by Marcus. It was then that Marcus finally looked up from his magazine. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as he folded the magazine along its spine with the precision of a man who respected even the smallest things in life. The sound of the paper folding seemed unusually loud in the tension-filled silence. He placed it carefully on the side table, smoothing out a dog-eared corner with his thumbnail. The small gesture carried an air of finality, like a chess master positioning their pieces before making a decisive move. The entire shop held its breath. Years of experience told them that moments like these usually ended in blood and sirens. But something was different this time, a shift in the usual power dynamic that Snake hadn't yet recognized, but was about to learn the hard way. Wilson had been cutting hair in this shop for over 30 years, long enough to know when violence was about to erupt. His weathered hands, marked with countless small scars from decades of wielding scissors and razors, trembled slightly as he stepped forward. The worn wooden floors creaked beneath his feet, drawing everyone's attention. His voice, though shaky, carried the urgency of a man trying to prevent an impending disaster. "Snake, you really don't want to do this. That's Marcus the Mountain Washington." The words hung in the air like static before a storm. Snake's face contorted in confusion, the name clearly meaning nothing to him. But around the shop, recognition rippled through the older customers. The regular in chair 3 lowered his newspaper. The man getting a lineup suddenly sat straighter. Even the teenage apprentice sweeping hair in the corner stopped mid-motion, his broom suspended in air. From his worn leather chair in the waiting area, old-timer Jenkins couldn't contain himself. He was a fixture of the shop, as permanent as the striped pole outside, and his gravelly voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen legends come and go. "Former heavyweight champion of England. 38 wins," he announced, then paused for effect before adding the most crucial detail. 35 by knockout. The mathematics of violence suddenly shifted in the room. Snake's cocky grin began to crack at the edges, like paint peeling from an old wall. His eyes darted to his reflection in the wall-length mirror, catching a glimpse of Marcus's massive frame behind him. For the first time, he truly saw what he was up against. Not just a big man, but a trained fighter whose size belied his speed and skill. It was then that Marcus rose from his chair. The movement was deliberate, almost graceful, like a glacier deciding to shift. The chair groaned in relief as his full 6'4" frame unfolded. His shadow seemed to expand, stretching across the checkered floor until it engulfed all 3 gang members. They unconsciously took a step back, their boots scuffing against the linoleum in perfect unison, a dance of instinctive retreat. In the mirrors that lined the walls, the scene multiplied infinitely. Marcus's imposing figure reflected dozens of times, surrounding the gang members from every angle. The afternoon sun, streaming through the shop's front window, caught the old boxing calluses on his massive hands, telling their own story of countless hours spent perfecting his craft. Snake's lieutenants, Diesel and Razor, suddenly found intense interest in their shoes, their previous bravado evaporating like morning dew. Their bodies tensed, caught between fight-or-flight instincts, neither option particularly appealing. The knife in Diesel's pocket felt remarkably inadequate now, like bringing a matchstick to a forest fire. The revelation had transformed the atmosphere in the shop. What had started as a typical gang intimidation tactic had morphed into something else entirely, a moment of reckoning. The younger customers, including young Buck who had been snickering earlier, sat in stunned silence, witnessing a masterclass in how reputations that took years to build could shatter in seconds. More telling than any of this was Marcus's expression. There was no anger there, no desire to prove anything. Instead, his face showed something far more terrifying to men like Snake, complete and absolute certainty. It was the look of someone who had nothing to prove, because he had already proven everything in rings across the world, against opponents far more formidable than three street thugs with delusions of grandeur. The air in Wilson's barbershop grew thick with tension, heavy as summer storm clouds about to break. Marcus stood at his full height, his massive frame casting long shadows across the checkered floor. But it was his voice that commanded attention, soft yet resonant, like distant thunder. "I retired from professional boxing to open a youth center," he began, each word measured and deliberate. A slight smile crossed his face, not one of amusement, but of resignation. "Teach kids there ain't no future in violence." The youth center was well known in the neighborhood, a converted warehouse on 43rd Street where Marcus spent his days teaching boxing basics, checking homework, and keeping kids off the streets. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that he now stood facing exactly the kind of situation he worked so hard to prevent. He sighed deeply, a sound heavy with the weight of experience. But some folks still need to learn hard way. Diesel, the youngest of the three gang members, felt the cold grip of fear crawling up his spine. Fight-or-flight instinct took over, and his hand moved to his jacket pocket, pulling out a switchblade. The fluorescent lights caught the blade as it snapped open with a metallic click that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet shop. His hand trembled slightly, betraying his nervousness. "There's three of us, old man," he managed to spit out, trying to inject confidence into his voice, but achieving something closer to desperation. Marcus's response was to carefully remove his reading glasses, the small gesture commanding everyone's attention. His massive hands, scarred from countless fights, and bearing the calluses of thousands of punches, handled the delicate frames with surprising gentleness. He folded them with precision, placing them beside his magazine on the side table. The deliberate nature of his movements only heightened the tension, like watching a master chef methodically sharpening their knives. "Then it might be fair," Marcus replied, his voice carrying a hint of amusement that sent chills down the spines of everyone present. The words weren't boastful. They were stated as simple fact, backed by years of professional experience and dozens of knocked-out opponents. His eyes, once soft with patience, now held the focused intensity that had made him famous in rings across the Atlantic. The barbershop had become an arena. The usual weekend crowd had transformed into an audience, frozen in place. Barbers with scissors suspended mid-snip, customers clutching magazines they'd stopped reading, the apprentice gripping his broom like a lifeline. Even the old wall clock seemed to tick more slowly, as if time itself was holding its breath. Snake's facade of confidence had crumbled entirely now. His eyes darted between his companions and the door, calculating odds that grew worse by the second. Razor, standing closest to the exit, had already taken another step backward, his shoulder blades nearly touching the glass door. The gang's usual intimidation tactics had backfired spectacularly, leaving them caught in their own trap. Wilson had retreated behind his chair, one hand resting on his phone, ready to call the police. But his worried expression had been replaced by something closer to anticipation. He had seen Marcus spar once, years ago, and knew what these young men were about to learn. That true power didn't need to announce itself with threats and swagger. The tension in the room had reached its breaking point. Every small movement seemed magnified. The soft creak of floorboards, the whisper of fabric as Marcus rolled his shoulders, the nervous swallow from Diesel as his knife hand trembled more visibly. The next few moments would either erupt in violence or end in retreat, and everyone present knew they were watching a turning point in neighborhood history. What happened next became the stuff of neighborhood legend. Snake threw the first punch, a wild haymaker that Marcus slipped with the kind of grace that seemed impossible for a man his size. His counter right hand dropped Snake like he'd been hit with a sledgehammer. Diesel lunged forward with his knife, but Marcus caught his wrist with practiced ease, twisting it just so until the young man went flying into the waiting area chairs. Razor made it halfway to the door before Marcus's legendary left hook introduced him to the linoleum floor. The entire incident lasted less than 10 seconds. In the aftermath, Marcus calmly straightened his shirt and returned to his chair, picking up his magazine as if nothing had happened. The barbershop erupted in cheers and applause, with young Buck staring open-mouthed at his barber. Marcus called out to Wilson, "Call the police, please. And when they've picked up this trash—" He smiled, settling back into his chair. "I still need my haircut." The story quickly spread throughout the neighborhood, and Wilson's barbershop enjoyed a peculiar peace after that. The 18th Street Cobras found other territory to claim, and Marcus continued his work at the youth center, teaching young people that true strength isn't about intimidation, it's about knowing when not to use it. And every Saturday, without fail, he sat in his usual chair, reading his magazine, a gentle giant who only showed his power when absolutely necessary,